gonna take just two chords. Hey ho ho, dee la la yo yo yo, dee dee la 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 yo yo, dee dee la 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 yo yo, dee dee la 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 ho ho, dee la la ho ho, dee dee la 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 yo yo, dee dee la 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 yo yo, yo yo yo.
Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? It's Wednesday, right? It is Wednesday. It's Wednesday. It's the middle of the week. Shabbos is almost here. And today on Daf Kuf Yud Vav, page 116. 116 pages. We've been studying the laws of Passover here in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 10, and at last, we're going to be talking about the most familiar aspects of the Passover Seder, the 4 questions, and the Haggadah, the great telling of the Exodus from Egypt that we do every year at Passover. This is a terrific page, and we got into it, continuing the song we started yesterday for the intro section. Shlomo Katz singing that Rova Chuppah Nigun. I mean, I just can't get enough of it. It's a long song, so yesterday we played the first 2 minutes, and today we played the middle 2 minutes, and tomorrow I'll play the last 2 minutes. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us as we get it going? Oh man, the 4 questions and the Haggadah. This is an exciting page. Who's with us tonight? Paul in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Indianapolis, Bill in Berkeley, Tom saying a Freilike Mittwoch. Paul, Mittwoch, right? Midweek, a beautiful and joyous midweek. Pauline in Arkansas, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy in North Carolina, Allison in North Carolina, John in Sedona, Crystal in British Columbia, Andrea says Shalom Aleichem, Renee in Indy, PK in Colorado, Michael in Scranton, Alan in Maryland, Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Linda says shalom. And Gigi, hello from British Columbia. Welcome, everybody. Great to be together. Lots to do, so let's just get right into it. We are going to be covering tonight, we're going to finish our discussion of the third Mishna here in chapter 10. We're going to begin and finish our discussion of Mishnah number 4. And we're going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 5. We are on page 116 of Tractate Pesachim, which has 121 pages. So we're really, really close to the end of our journey through the laws of Passover according to the Talmud. You know, we spent so many weeks, months even, discussing, you know, the intricate laws of clearing the chametz out of the house and what is matzah and how to eat matzah, how to make matzah, when it becomes leavened, when it's unleavened. And then so much time we spent on the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, how it was offered when the temple was standing, and all the intricacies of those laws. And now when we come to the actual familiar aspects to the modern ear and eye of the Passover Seder, we're just going to cover them so quickly. So hold on to your socks. I wish we could spend months on just this page. We really could spend so much time on it. But we're just going to, we're running through it today, okay? So this is a big day. You can say, thank God we're here together. You didn't want to miss this one. All right. So finishing our discussion of the third Mishnah, and that Mishnah is about the bitter herb that we eat at the Passover Seder and the charoset that we dip it into. Somebody asked yesterday, what is charoset? right? So charoset is this mixture. We're actually going to be talking about what it's made out of momentarily, but it's this mixture that's a dip that we use at the Passover Seder. It's sweet and tasty, often made with some nuts and apples and raisins, some grape juice. And then, different people have different traditions about what kinds of spices, or do they add figs to it, etc. Why do we eat the charoset? We're actually going to be discussing that right now. But normally, the main thing about it is that we dip the bitter herb into it during the Passover Seder before we eat the festive meal, when we're making the blessings on the ritual foods that are involved in the Seder. The Mishna states that they bring the charoset to the leader of the Seder, although eating charoset is not a mitzvah. That's this opinion. Stay tuned on that. The Gemara asks, and if it is not a mitzvah, if it is not an obligation, right? A mitzvah is a commandment, an obligation. And if it is not a mitzvah, for what reason does one bring it to the Seder? Rabbi Ami said, it is brought due to the poison in the bitter herbs, which is neutralized by the charoset. In this regard, Rav Asi said, the remedy for one who ate the poison in lettuce is to eat a radish. The remedy for the poison in a radish is leeks. The remedy for the poison in leeks is hot water. And a remedy for the poison in all vegetables is hot water. What are they talking about, right? So there's this idea that vegetables, and particularly bitter vegetables, carry some kind of a poison. Were they talking about some kind of a microscopic health concern? There's a note here from Rav Steinsaltz. Some commentaries maintain that in this context, the word poison is referring to the evil spirit that rested on one's hands after eating these herbs, unless they were first dipped in charoset. All I'm going to say, so is this kind of like, in terms of the poison and getting rid of the poison, is this more like, like a folk tradition? That aspect of it is not the sages commenting, about Torah law. But it was consistent with the traditions of that time and place. I will say, however, that I was many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I remember this so clearly. I went to see my dermatologist, and I was in the parking lot, waiting for my car to be come down. Like in that medical building, you had to wait for your car to be brought to you. And I was talking to the parking attendant, who was like a really colorful, conversational type of guy. He was African American. And we got to talking, and he said, well, when you get to my age, you've seen it all. And I was like, well, you don't look so old. He looked to me like he was maybe 65, something like that. And he told me that he was 89. So this is an 89-year-old man working as a parking lot attendant. I said to him, you look amazing. You do not look like you're in your late 80s. I would have guessed your 60s, maybe mid-60s. He said, well, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you my secret to long life. And he's sitting there smoking a cigarette as he's talking to me, right? This 20 years ago. So I said, don't you think the cigarettes interfere with long life? He said, nah, the cigarettes don't mean a thing. He said, the reason I've lived a long time is because I learned from my mom, and he had grown up in Alabama. He said, I learned from my mom that all vegetables have to be boiled. And my whole life, I never ate a raw vegetable. I'm not saying that that is the secret to long life. I'm just telling you that this guy was incredibly spry, 89 years old, still working, and he attributed it to all his vegetables his whole life had been boiled. I move on. Okay. And so in the meantime, while one is waiting, so if somebody eats these vegetables and he feels that he needs hot water, so similar, right? Similar to what's being said here. In the meantime, while one is waiting for someone to bring him the hot water as a remedy for the poison in these raw vegetables, let him say the following incantation: poison, poison, I remember you and your 7 daughters and your 8 daughters-in-law. I don't know why that incantation works. There it is. The Mishnah states, Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Tzadok, says that eating charoset is a mitzvah. It is a commandment, an obligation. The Gemara asks, what is the nature of this mitzvah? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Levi says, it is in remembrance of the apple. And the verse, it is in remembrance of the apple, as apple is one of the ingredients in charoset. So there should be apple in charoset. And the verse states, this is from Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 5. Who is this who comes up from the wilderness, reclining upon her beloved? Under the apple tree I awakened you. Which is an allusion to the Jewish people leaving Egypt. So it's this idea that, so we have this familiar imagery that the Jewish people are the bride and God is the husband. And so like the Song of Songs is a love song between a man and a woman, but spiritually, figuratively speaking, it's a love song between the Jewish people and our Creator and the Creator. And so this idea that he found us under the apple tree and took us away from there, said, come my beloved, and took us away from there. I actually looked up this verse and read the Rashi on it. Very interesting. Rashi's comment on who is this who comes up from the wilderness, reclining upon her beloved, under the apple tree I awakened you. He reads it differently. I awakened you, right? The reading here in the Haggadah is like God awakened us, like we were dozing in the spiritual lowland, and we were spiritually at such a low level when we were slaves in Egypt, and somehow the apple tree refers to Egypt, and that's where God found us. Rashi reads it differently. He says that the apple refers to an apple that was suspended over our head in the same manner as Mount Sinai was suspended over our head. And we've seen that midrash before, the idea that when the children of Israel were assembled around Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, and while Moses was up at the top of the mountain receiving all of the Torah from God, but just before the Ten Commandments, there's this idea that God picked up the entire mountain, held it over our heads, and say, if you accept to be bound by these commandments, all well and good. But if you don't, I will drop this mountain on you, and that'll be the end of the Jewish people. Almost as if we were coerced into coming into this contract. But it's a kind of loving coercion in the same idea that, parents say to their children, this is the way that you will behave, because parents know better than the children how the children should behave and what is good for them. That's not what the children want to do. It's the parents' obligation to tell them how to behave. And that's what God did for us. So according to Rashi, the apple in this verse, right, is like Mount Sinai being held over our heads. But where it says, I awakened you, it doesn't mean God awakened us. According to Rashi, it's I awakened you, the bride speaking to the husband. The bride speaking to the husband. And this is familiar from Hasidic Jewish theology, this idea that when we pray to God and praise God and tell God that we love God, it arouses the divine. It gives God pleasure and makes his attention draw toward us in a kind and loving way. How do we know that we can arouse emotion in God, both anger and pleasure? Because the Torah says so, right? When we bring our sacrifices, God says in the Torah, this is a pleasing aroma to the divine. And of course, there are other times when we behave in such terrible, abominable ways, pursuing idols, killing each other, just any kinds of terrible sins. This angers God, particularly idolatry, because God is a jealous God. So God characterizes God's self in these emotional terms. God is beyond emotion. God is characterizing God's self that way for our understanding. But the fact is, God is telling us that he has given us the power to arouse emotion in God. And that's how Rashi is reading this line. At any rate, the apple is intimately associated with the relationship between God and the Jewish people, and it's included, it's one of the ingredients in the charoset, which we use at the Passover Seder. And Rabbi Yochanan says, the charoset, this is the more familiar image, Rabbi Yochanan says the charoset is in remembrance of the mortar used by the Jews for their slave labor in Egypt, right? We were building cities and pyramids and fences and walls made out of bricks held together by mortar. And that mortar is symbolized on the Seder plate by the charoset. Abaye said, therefore, to fulfill both opinions, one must prepare it tart, meaning that the charoset should include apple, right? That's what makes it tart. And one must prepare it thick, right? It shouldn't be like very thin and liquidy. It should be thick like the mortar between the bricks. One must prepare it tart in remembrance of the apple, and one must prepare it thick in remembrance of the mortar. It was taught in a baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. The spices used in the charoset are in remembrance of the hay that our forefathers used for the building in Egypt. In other words, the bricks themselves were made out of hay that we needed to gather and form bricks, combined with mud to make the bricks. And the charoset itself is in remembrance of the mortar. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said, when selling charoset, the small shopkeepers in Jerusalem would say as follows, come and take spices for yourselves for the mitzvah. It's so interesting that this Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, is quoting the shopkeepers in Jerusalem at the time that the temple was standing, and people would make that pilgrimage festival up to Jerusalem, and they would celebrate Passover in Jerusalem and en masse, right? They would, in groups, register on the Paschal lamb, and then they would eat the Passover lamb along with the festival peace offering, along with these ritual foods on Passover night. But the question that's being argued right now is eating charoset a mitzvah or not? And the rabbi, rather than saying, well, I heard from Rabbi so-and-so that this is a mitzvah, he says, well, the shopkeepers were saying, come get spices for the mitzvah, meaning for charoset, and that's evidence that it was a mitzvah. And indeed, it's a mitzvah. The halacha of charoset, it is a mitzvah to eat charoset, in commemoration of the apples and the mortar. The custom is to prepare it thick like clay and to add spicy herbs. The Sephardic custom is to prepare charoset from the fruits used to describe the Jewish people in the prophets and in Song of Songs, e.g., figs, apples, and dates. Figs, apples, and dates is in the Sephardic charoset. Another custom is to add spices such as cinnamon and ginger in memory of the hay, or vinegar or red wine in memory of the blood. You could say either the blood of the first plague of the 10 plagues, or the blood that was shed by all the Jews who were tortured in Egypt, including when the Jewish boys were cast into the Nile, which would have been Moses' fate if his mother had not put him in a basket, which was then recovered by Pharaoh's daughter. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Now, Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 10, the 4 questions. The attendants poured the second cup for the leader of the Seder, right? We pour the second cup of wine. This is before the festive meal. And before we drink that second cup of wine, we pour it, but we don't bless it or drink it. And at that point comes the great bulk of the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah, which is introduced by the 4 questions, which prompt the telling of the story. So they pour the second cup, and here the son asks his father the questions about the differences between Passover night and a regular night. And if the son does not have the intelligence to ask questions on his own because he is too young, his father teaches him the questions. The Mishnah lists the questions, right? So the child asking questions is what prompts the telling of the Exodus from Egypt. This Mishnah right here, Mishnah number 4 in chapter 10 of Tractate Pesachim, this is the home address of the obligation for the 4 questions and the telling of the story on Passover night. Interesting, this Mishna, which is originally composed while the Second Temple was still standing, lists a different set of 4 questions than the 4 questions we are familiar with today. So the Mishnah lists the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? As on all other nights, we eat leavened bread and matzah as preferred, but on this night, all our bread is matzah. On all other nights, we eat vegetables. On this night, we eat bitter herbs. On all other nights, we eat meat either roasted, stewed, or cooked, but on this night, all the meat is roasted, right? That's not any longer one of our 4 questions, but you can see why it was one of the 4 questions when the temple was standing, when people were bringing the Paschal lamb as a sacrifice, and then they were slaughtering it in the temple courtyard, and then they would bring it outside, and in their groups, they would roast that lamb whole, and then they would each eat a little piece of the Paschal lamb. Once the temple was destroyed, we can't do that anymore, and they had to reconfigure these questions. And the 4th question of the original 4 questions, on all other nights, we dip the vegetables in a liquid during the meal only once. However, on this night, we dip twice. And according to the intelligence and the ability of the son, his father teaches him all or part of these questions. When teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory. That right there is the structural obligation of the story we tell on Passover night. What the story must do is begin with the Jewish people's degradation, meaning we were slaves in Egypt, and end with their glory. God took us out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, parted the sea for us, brought us to Mount Sinai, and gave us the Torah, perhaps the apogee of Jewish history. And he expounds, the leader of the Seder expounds from the passage at Deuteronomy 26:5, an Aramaean tried to destroy my father. Interesting that, I just want to have that in front of me. So Deuteronomy 26, Chabad. I always like to read Bible verses from there first, or Safari. I used both. But here, so that this thing, an Aramaean sought to destroy my father, and then the verses which follow it, Deuteronomy 26:5 through 10, we say that when the temple is standing and we are bringing the first fruits, right? The first fruits of the year, and the first fruits of a particular tree, we bring those as an offering in the temple, and then we recite this, right? So you shall take the first of all of the fruit of the ground, which you shall bring from the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put them in a basket and go to the place which the Lord God will choose to have his name dwell there. That's the holy temple. And you shall come to the Cohen, the priest, who will be serving in those days, and say to him, I declare this day to the Lord your God that I have come to the land which the Lord swore to our forefathers to give us. The priest will take the basket from your hand, laying the fruits before the altar of the Lord your God. And you shall call out and say before the Lord your God, an Aramaean sought to destroy my ancestor, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there with a small number of people, and there he became great, mighty, and a numerous nation. And as I read these verses from the Torah, you see in the Passover Haggadah, we take each of these verses or even phrases from the verses, and the rabbis of the Mishnah, who are listed in the Haggadah, doing what we're doing here, studying Mishnahs in the Haggadah, they expound these verses, and it's from a recitation we say when we bring the first fruits, but it becomes the backbone, the spine of the sort of analysis and critical thinking and telling of the story that we do in the Passover Haggadah, right? So my ancestor, he went down to Egypt and sojourned there with a small number of people, and there he became a great, mighty, and numerous nation. And the Egyptians treated us cruelly and afflicted us, and they imposed hard labor upon us, right? And in the Haggadah, then we look at each of those phrases. They treated us cruelly and afflicted us and imposed hard labor. And then they say what those things mean, that husbands and wives were separated, that the labor was very heavy, that we couldn't breathe, etc. That's all part of the Haggadah, but it's interpreting these verses at Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 10. So we cried out to the Lord, God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And they expound those words as well. And the Lord brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm, with great awe and with signs and wonders. And the rabbis will expound what those words mean. And he brought us to this place, the Holy Land, and he gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, behold, I have brought the first fruit of the land which the Lord your God has given me. That part doesn't get included in the Haggadah, but the preamble of bringing the fruits, that recitation we would say in the temple when the temple was standing, becomes that backbone of the Haggadah. And the obligation to make that the backbone of the Haggadah is listed here in the Mishna on our page today. So he begins with disgrace and concludes with glory. And he expounds from the passage in Aramaic, tried to destroy my father, until he concludes explaining the entire section. That's the Mishnah number 4. The Gemara. The rabbis, the sages taught, if his son is wise and knows how to inquire, his son asks him, the leader of the Seder. And if the son is not wise, his wife asks him. And even if his wife is not capable of asking, or if he does not have a wife, then he asks himself. And even if 2 Torah scholars who know the laws of Passover are sitting together and there is no one else present to pose the questions, they ask each other, right? That the idea of asking questions to prompt not a dry recitation of a script, but rather to prompt discussion, Torah study, the kind of discussion you and I have been doing here every day for the last year and some months. That's what the sages want to happen around the dinner table, around the Seder table, on Passover night. They want discussion. And they start by saying, okay, this is how we ask questions and this is how we answer, but we're just modeling the idea of questions and answers. And that's why even if Torah scholars and only Torah scholars are celebrating the Seder together, they know it all. They don't need to review these studies. They've been reviewing them for 30 days. Nevertheless, one must ask the questions, the other begins the answers, and it starts to prompt that kind of discussion. The Mishnah states that one of the questions is, why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights, we dip once. On this night, we dip twice. Rava strongly objects to this statement of the Mishnah. Is that to say that on every other day, there is no alternative but to dip once? Is there an obligation to dip at all on other days, as indicated by the wording of the Mishnah? Rather, Rava said that this is what the Mishnah is teaching. On all other nights, we are not obligated to dip even once. But on this night, we are obligated to dip twice. Rav Safra strongly objects to Rava's explanation. He said, is it obligatory for the children? As previously mentioned, the reason one dips twice is to encourage the children to ask questions. How can this be called an obligation? Rather, Rav Safra said that this is what the Mishnah is teaching. We do not normally dip even once. However, on this night we dip twice. The wording is preferable as it indicates that the performance of the dipping is an optional act that the sages encouraged us to do because it would seem strange to the children and prompt them to ask questions. Hey, what are you doing? Why are you dipping twice? Normally we don't do that. It was taught in the Mishnah that the father begins his answer with disgrace and concludes with glory. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the term with disgrace? And the Rav said that one should begin by saying, at first our forefathers were idol worshippers, before concluding with words of glory. And Shmuel says the disgrace with which one should begin his answer is, we were slaves. What was the disgrace of the Jewish people when we were in Egypt? Is it that we were slaves, or is it that we were idol worshippers? Slaves is terrible, but we didn't do that to ourselves. Somebody else did that to us. That's why Rav says better to say that our disgrace is something we brought on ourselves, that we were idol worshipers, right? That we even participated in the religion of that spiritually low place when we were enslaved there. But Shmuel says, listen, the main thing that was going on is that we were enslaved, we were short of breath, and it was a terrible degradation of this nation of priests that we would become, that we would be living in such a state. And you have to really bring home what it was like to be enslaved in Egypt. Rav Nachman said to his servant Daru, with regard to a slave who is freed by his master, and who also gives him gold and silver, what should the slave say to him? Daru said to him in response, well, he must thank and praise his master. And so Rav Nachman said to him, if so, you have exempted us from reciting the questions of why is this night different? As you have stated the essence of the Seder night, Rav Nachman immediately began to recite, we were slaves. There's a note here, and that is actually the end of the commentary on Mishnah number 4. That's it. It's unbelievable. It's so brief. That list, that Mishnah and its discussion, which we just concluded, lists the obligation to do the 4 questions in the earlier form from the Second Temple period, and the telling of the tale. I mean, like that, it's summarized right there. We have a note, what is with disgrace? According to Shmuel's opinion, the disgrace is the slavery in Egypt. Highlighting the slavery also highlights God's love and salvation. Rav identifies the disgrace as the practice of idolatry by the ancestors of the Jews. This must be mentioned because the fact that God took the Jewish people out of Egypt, despite their idolatrous origins, serves to praise him all the more. And so, of course, both of these statements are included in the Haggadah. I have here the very classic traditional Maxwell House Haggadah that so many families use. So how did the 4 questions end up? Right? How did they get changed once we were no longer bringing the Paschal lamb after the temple was destroyed? So the 4 questions are, why is this night different from all other nights? All other nights we may eat either bread or matzah, but on this night, only matzah. All other nights we may eat any species of greens, but this night, bitter herbs. All other nights we do not dip even once, but on this night, twice. All other nights we eat and drink either sitting or reclining, but on this night, all of us recline. That's the form that it finally took. And then having asked the questions, we can launch into the telling of the tale. And it has to take us from degradation to glory. And so the tale begins, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and our God brought us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And then a little later in the telling of the Haggadah, it says, in the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers, but at the present, the deity, God has brought us near to divine service, as it is said. And so we basically are following both opinions of both Shmuel and Rav in doing that. Now, we move forward because there's so much to do. Mishnah number 5. Rabban Gamliel would say, and now this is like direct language that is very familiar to anyone who's been to a Passover Seder. This Mishnah is basically directly imported into the Passover Haggadah. Rabban Gamliel would say, anyone who did not say these 3 matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation: the Paschal lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs. When one mentions these matters, he must elaborate and explain them. The Paschal lamb is brought because the Almighty passed over Pesach, he passed over. That's where the holiday gets its name. The Almighty passed over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt, as it is stated, that you shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's paschal offering, for he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. That's Exodus 12:27. And Rabban Gamliel continues, the reason for matzah is because our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt, as it is said. By the way, it's very nice. As it is said, the Hebrew of that is shene'emar, something that I picked up in Uman, Ukraine. It's very beautiful. When you read, we do this at Rosh Hashanah in Uman, but it's great for Passover too, that every time you get to as it is stated, meaning they're going to quote a verse from the Torah, the word for that is shene'emar. And so like the one who's reading that paragraph says, as it is stated, and everyone else around the Passover table says, shene'emar, kinds of sing it. It means as it is stated, and then he reads the verse from the Torah. But it's fun and very beautiful. So every time you get to as it is stated, everyone sings, shene'emar. So where am I? As it is stated. Yeah, our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt, as it is stated, shene'emar, and they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt as cakes of matzahs, for it was not leavened, as they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. That's Exodus 12:39. The reason for the bitter herbs is because the Egyptians embittered our forefathers' lives in Egypt, as it is stated, shene'emar, and they embittered their lives with hard service in mortar and in brick, in all manner of service in the field, all the service that they made them serve with rigor. The Tana of the Mishna further states, shene'emar, in each and every generation, a person, this is it right here. This is the key verse of the whole Passover night. In each and every generation, a person must view himself as though he personally left Egypt, as it is stated, shene'emar, and you shall tell your son on that day, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Exodus 13:8. It is not enough to just tell over these verses and communicate them to the next generation, important as that is. You have to literally feel like you were there. You came out of Egypt. You were enslaved. And God rescued you from that bondage. That's how we have to feel. And that's why I always say, if you can come to Seder, to the Passover Seder, prepared that in your mind you want to break free of some destructive behavior, then that behavior that you've been enslaved to, that's your Pharaoh. And at the Seder, you keep in the back of your mind that you're asking God, you're crying out to God to free you from your current bondage, And if God would do that, then it's such a personal experience, like as if you experienced coming out of Egypt. In every generation, each person must say, this which the Lord did for me, and not this which the Lord did for my ancestors. The Mishnah continues with the text of the Haggadah. Therefore, we are obligated to thank, praise, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, and laud the one who performed for our ancestors and for us all these miracles. He took us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to great light, and from enslavement to redemption. And we will say before him, Hallelujah. At this point, one recites the Hallel that is said on all joyous days. We have an obligation to recite Hallel on Yom Tov, on festivals. Since one does not complete Hallel, right? It's a series of psalms, of songs in praise and thanksgiving, the Psalms 113 through 118. Since one does not complete, and so what we were just saying there is part of Hallel, right? So from Psalm 113. Since one does not complete Hallel at this point in the Seder, the Mishnah asks, until where does one recite the Hallel? Beis Shammai say, until who makes the barren woman dwell in her house as a joyful mother of children. Hallelujah. That's Psalms 113:9. Beis Hillel say, we recite the Hallel until we reach the verse, who turned the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a fountain of waters. That's Psalm 114, verse 8. And one concludes this section of Hallel with a blessing that refers to redemption. And of course, the halacha, the law, follows Beis Hillel, as it almost always does. And so if you look in the Haggadah, when we start to recite the Hallel, we reach that line. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who turned the flint into a fountain. Rabbi Tarfon says that although one should recite who redeemed us and redeemed our forefathers from Egypt, one who did so would not conclude with the formula, blessed are you, Lord. Rabbi Akiva says that one recites a different version of this blessing. So too the Lord our God and the God of our forefathers will bring us to future holidays and festivals in peace, and happy over the building of your city, and joyous in your service, and there we will eat from the Paschal lamb and other offerings, etc., until we reach, blessed are you, Lord, who redeemed Israel. And the halacha is the formula of the Haggadah. The Haggadah must include the passage starting with, therefore we are obligated, until the flint into a fountain of waters. That is the Mishnah, Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 10. Now we continue with the Gemara on that Mishnah. Rava said, when mentioning the Exodus from Egypt, one must say, and he took us out from there. Furthermore, Rava said, when one mentions matzah in the list of the three matters one must recall during the Seder, he must lift it for display before the assembled company. Likewise, when discussing the bitter herbs, one must raise them. However, nowadays, one need not raise the meat, meaning after the temple was destroyed, when the rabbis of the Gemara were living in times after the temple had been destroyed, there was no more Paschal lamb, no more bringing the offering. It's commemorated on the Seder plate with a shank bone, but we don't obviously roast the whole lamb and eat of the Paschal lamb. So even though we're reciting these verses, when we talk about the matzah, we lift the matzah. When we talk about the bitter herb, we lift the bitter herb. When we talk about the meat, we do not lift the shank bone because it's a tragedy. It's a sadness to us that we can no longer bring that offering. And not only that, but it is prohibited to raise the meat, for if one lifts the meat, it appears as though he is eating sacrificial meat outside the temple, which is a serious transgression. Rav Acha bar Yaakov said, a blind person is exempt from reciting the Haggadah. And the proof is that it is written here with regard to the Paschal lamb, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it is written there in another part of the Torah with regard to the stubborn and rebellious son, that his parents say, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He does not listen to our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. That's Deuteronomy 21:20. And the Gemara explains, and then you bring that boy actually to be stoned and killed. But in the whole history of the Jewish people, there's actually no recorded instance of parents fulfilling that particular law, that if their son is such a glutton and a ne'er-do-well that he's destined to become a criminal, that they would bring him before the elders of the city and say he's a no-goodnik and he needs to be stoned and executed. And it has never happened. And the sages made it impossible for it to happen because the definition of a glutton and a drunkard is somebody who consumes such an extraordinary amount of food and liquor that it's humanly impossible to do that. And so there is no way There never has been to fulfill that particular obligation. But the point here is that the word this is in both of those verses. This which the Lord did for me, and this son of ours. And the Gemara explains the verbal analogy of the word this. Just as there, in the case of the rebellious son, the sages expound that the verse excludes a blind person, as a blind parent cannot say this son and point to him. So too here, in the case of the recitation of the Passover Haggadah, the word this serves to exclude blind people. It's not that they're not permitted to perform the service, it's that they're not obligated to perform it, to lead the Seder. And the Gemara asks, wait a minute, is that so? But didn't Maremar say, I asked the sages from the school of Rav Yosef, who was blind, who recited the Haggadah in the house of Rav Yosef? And they said to him, Rav Yosef himself recited it. And Maremar subsequently asked, well, who recited the Haggadah in the house of Rav Sheshes, who was also blind? And they said to him, Rav Sheshes himself recited it. Now this indicates that a blind person is not only permitted, but he's obligated to recite the Haggadah just like anybody else. I mean, obviously if he can't read, but if he can memorize it, then he's obligated to recite it. Or if he can repeat after somebody, then he's obligated to recite it, just like everybody else, despite being blind. And the Gemara answers, these sages, Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, maintain that nowadays the halachas, the laws of eating matzah and the recitation of the Haggadah that accompanies it, this is the matzah, apply by rabbinic law. And for this reason, blind people can recite the Haggadah for others, right? To be the leader of the Seder. And the Gemara asks, does this prove, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in now. The Gemara asks, does this prove by inference that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov maintains that eating matzah nowadays applies by Torah law? But isn't Rav Acha Bar Yaakov the one who said that eating matzah nowadays applies by rabbinic law? Meaning, it says in the Torah, you shall eat matzah on the night of Passover, but it says that you shall eat the Paschal lamb with matzah and bitter herbs. Since we can no longer eat the lamb, are we still obligated by Torah law to eat the matzah and the bitter herbs? That's the question that's being asked here. For sure, we're obligated, but is it the rabbis who decreed that we should keep doing that, eating matzah and bitter herbs on Passover, and that's why we do it? Or is it actually a Torah obligation, a Torah law? Rav Acha Bar Yaakov apparently contradicts himself, and the Gemara answers, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov maintains that everything the sages instituted through their decrees, they instituted similar to the model established by Torah law. In other words, although the obligations to eat matzah and recite the Haggadah are rabbinic, the stringencies and restrictions that apply to Torah commandments apply here as well. Therefore, a blind person is exempt from reciting the Haggadah. The Gemara asks, well, according to the opinion of Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef too, certainly everything the sages instituted through their decrees, they instituted similar to the model established by Torah law. Why then did these blind sages recite the Haggadah on behalf of the assembled company themselves? And the Gemara rejects this difficulty. How can these cases, the verses dealing with the rebellious son and the Passover Haggadah, be compared? Granted, there, in the case of the rebellious son, as the verse could have written, he is our son, and instead it is written, this son of ours, I can learn from it that parents must point to the finger to their son, which comes to exclude blind parents. However, here, if the verse did not use the word because of this, he's not pointing at the matzah. He's talking about this, which the Lord did for me. What could have been written in reference to the matzahs and bitter herbs? Rather, this verse comes because the matzah and bitter herbs. Consequently, there is no need to actually point with one's finger in this instance, and therefore the blind are also obligated to recite the Haggadah. Right? And as we saw, it's not that we just point to the matzah and the bitter herbs, we lift them up. Okay, that's what I've got for us this evening. Let's go to your comments and questions. I catch my breath. Here we go. Okay. Tom Payne. Shalom. Vegetables do carry poison, especially courgettes. I spit on courgettes. Poo, 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 poo. Meaning zucchini. Okay. Thank you, Tom. Patrick Walker, boiling everything is an Irish cooking technique. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We're learning all kinds of new stuff. Sharon, again, if it is a mitzvah, why do we not say a bracha at all for charoset? Never mind a mitzvah blessing or not. How is it defined as a mitzvah? It just seems to be that it's a mitzvah that, because the sages said to do it, we're obligated to eat charoset on Passover, but it seems to be, captured by the fact that when do we eat it? We've already made a bracha on matzah. So I guess there that the fact that, as a food, it's already included in the meal blessing, the matzah blessing that exempts other foods. In terms of the mitzvah blessing, who sanctifies us with his commandments, commands us to eat the bitter herb. That's because it's mentioned in the Torah. But I guess they didn't think, they did not say that the charoset, there are rabbinic decrees which are worded, who sanctifies us with his commandments, commands us to, for example, kindle the Hanukkah lights. Obviously, that was not mentioned in the Torah because Hanukkah is a post-biblical holiday. But nevertheless, it is deemed like a mitzvah, and we make a mitzvah blessing on it, but we don't on the charoset. So somehow the sages did not take it that far that it would have its own separate blessing, but it is considered an obligation and a mitzvah even so. Sharon, sounds like you are singing Shene Emar as in the end of Aleinu. Is that what you are doing? Shene Emar. I wasn't thinking of Aleinu, but it's like where I got that melody is from the, what's the name of our minyan in Uman? I'm just having a brain blip. It'll come to me in a second. But at any rate, our minyan in Uman, Ukraine, for Rosh Hashanah is a Carlebach minyan. And so like the morning service of Rosh Hashanah goes from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. We really take our time with it. And during Rosh Hashanah, there's all these verses that are read from the Torah which have the word shofar in them, and other verses that have the word king in them. And there's a whole other set that I can't remember at this moment. And so when we expound those verses during the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, it constantly says, as it is stated, and then the verse from the Torah is read, and our Kehillah, our congregation, always sings Shene Emar. And so I brought that home for our Passover Seder, and we had fun doing that, just me, Nina, and the kids last year during our, very small and cozy COVID Seder the first time. And looks like we're having another one of those this year. Right, our Kehillah is called Nekuda Tova. Nekuda Tova is a concept from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. It's very much a Breslov event there in Uman, Ukraine. And Nekuda Tova is this idea that everyone has a good point inside of them. Tova is good, and Nekuda is that little point, right? So everybody has a very special little point that is unique to them and beautiful. And Nekuda Tova is all about bringing that out, acknowledging that in other people, and respecting them and loving them for that. And finally, Tom says regarding this Shene Emar, as it is said, we do that. Although we don't sing it, we chant it 3 times. Beautiful. I wasn't aware of that tradition, but you have something similar in your home. Oh, gorgeous, gorgeous. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. Can you believe it? That after 4 months of the loss of Passover, when we finally came to the Haggadah and the 4 questions, it's pretty much all in one day, right? But there'll be some more tomorrow on the same subject. Now that we've gotten into, the Haggadah and how it is worded and singing the Hallel within it, that discussion is going to continue tomorrow. So with God's help, we'll be together tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a terrific, terrific night. All the best.